To ask the second question to Shabir, can you simply name one prophecy of Muhammad in the New Testament? Just name the book chapter.
You're asking if the New Testament prophesies the coming of the Prophet Muhammad? I don't have a direct reference that there is a particular verse that says that Muhammad is coming, but there are passages in the New Testament which Muslims see as references to the Prophet Muhammad, though in a form now which makes it difficult for Christians to recognize these as a reference. But we would cite John chapter 16 verse 7, for example.
John 16, 7 or 14, but they've been changed. May I ask one more question to Shabir?
Yeah, 30 seconds.
Okay. It seems okay when the British school teacher had her class name the teddy bear Muhammad, you know what happened. I mean, if she had named him Ibrahim or Isa, I think it would have been a different story. Why is it that Muslims reject idolatry but seem to idolize Muhammad, calling him Savior of the world, Lord of the universe, sinless? I get the feeling if we insulted Allah, that would be bad, but to insult Muhammad would be greater, which seems an inversion of the principle against idolatry in Muslim religion.
At this time, what I'd like to do is invite Shabir Ally to cross-examine both or one of his opponents for 5 minutes.
Doug, I'll have to answer your question later on during the rebuttal phase or something like that. But boy, do I have some questions for you. Okay, well, keeping it friendly, you refer to chapter 4, verse 34 of the Quran, which Muslims commonly have interpreted as a reference to the permission for men to beat their wives. But I don't know if you've studied the Arabic of that text yourself, have you?
Of course not.
Okay. Recently on our television broadcast, I've had occasion to explain numerous times, and I also wrote a paper which I presented before 2 of my university profs at U of T, who are specialists in Islamic studies in the Department of Near and Middle East Civilizations, and it's been greeted with approval. The paper basically argues that this verse, though commonly interpreted as meaning that a man could beat his wife, has been entirely misinterpreted altogether. The verse taken in its context within the Quranic chapter in which it occurs, actually it's a verse dealing with the penalty for adultery to be administered by state authorities. This particular verse deals with administering it to women, and there are other verses which deal with administering to men. Well, I guess I just made a follow-up from that. That's my question, and the follow-up is done. To continue then, my statement about that verse very simply is that verse is not about beating wives. So your objection to the Quran fails on that account, I believe. In terms of violence, you are aware, of course, that in the New Testament there are numerous references to the approval of violence, even though it is quite clear that the early Christians lived in an environment where they could not have state power and political rule, and so they could not do the kinds of things that people in military rule do. But what do you make of the statement of Jesus where he compares himself to a king who will return and say, "Bring my enemies here and slay them before me"?
That Matthew 22 is a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem 40 years later, not by Jesus or Christians, but by pagan Roman armies. Jesus said we can't use violence.
I wasn't referring to Matthew 22, I was referring to Luke chapter 19, verse 21, where Jesus compares himself to the king who would do this.
Jesus has executive authority, and in the judgment day, that is how he will act. But that's
so you're
not
saying
part
that
of the religion, that's part of the...
Is my 5 minutes up? I thought it was only 2. Anyway.
Quickest 5 minutes.
My watch is showing 2 and some, but that's fine. Yeah? So then you're accepting that one who has executive authority, whether God himself or one acting on God's authority, can actually inflict great violence on people, beheading them, slaying them.
No, I'm not. I'm saying at the judgment day, that's a different issue. I mean, even the Muslims say Jesus is coming back and this is the beginning of the judgment. So this is not part of our earthly life. So no human has the right to do that. The New Testament does not approve of violence.
Okay. Now, the New Testament, of course, as you rightly said, builds on the Old, and it accepts the validity of the Old, at least in its moral teachings, though not in the particulars about the prescriptive law.
Depends how you define moral. I would give a qualified yes.
Would you say that something that God does and reported in the Old Testament would be immoral?
No, but things change. There's a principle of abrogation within Judaism just as there is within Islam.
But if something is morally wrong, God wouldn't do it at any time.
Are you talking about God or are you talking about people?
I'm talking about God.
Okay, well, no. God is still the judge, the final judge in both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament.
Is it morally wrong for God to instruct one of his prophets or righteous or holy men in this life to slay the enemies?
Today it is, yes. Jesus said that is
But
no
at one
longer.
time it wasn't.
That's correct.
So the moral nature of God changes, according to you.
That's not the moral nature, it's what God permits us to do.
I'll leave it at that.
There's a difference.
Thank you very much.